Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name's Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel. And welcome to the hotly anticipated sequel to the 5 builds to make Seraph cry. This is now 5 builds to make Seraph soil his armor. Just want to start off by saying thank you to all you on YouTube who have been watching the videos and who have subscribed. We just hit, as of today when I'm recording this, 500 subscribers, which for me is like a really big deal. I don't talk about it a whole lot, but starting to stream was just kind of something I thought I would do as a way to kind of build a community experience around my gaming, and it's been doing a lot better than I was expecting. So I really appreciate it. I'm hoping that you guys like the content. I hope you guys enjoy this guide. If you do and you have not subscribed, would love to see your subscription. As well, if you want to ever watch live, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/never_Nathaniel. But yeah, with that, let's just jump into it. Starting at the beginning. So each one of the builds in this guide is what I would consider Covenant 25 ready. And there are 3 basic criteria that I use to judge whether a run can succeed consistently. I think these are very common. If you look at like the Monster Train community, a lot of people give similar advice on what you need in a build to make it succeed. First is the build must be able to clear large units, not necessarily in a single attack round, but across all of your floors. By the end, when you're fighting Seraph, and even on floor 7 or ring 7, you're often going to see tanks or frontliners that have anywhere from 150 to 190 health. And so yeah, being able to have a big burst that can happen through spells, that can happen with unit damage, but some way that you can clear large units. The second is you need to have at least backline access of greater than 10. To be safer, probably even greater than 20, but minimum of 10. And again, that can come in a variety of ways. That can come through sweep, that can come through spells, that can come through trample, multi-strike, just a lot of units. There are a lot of different ways to get there, but you have to be able to access the backline, because what often happens is if you can't kill the frontliners and the backliners, they're going to end up hitting your pyre. The frontliners will be dangerous because of their large health total, and the backliners are going to be dangerous because of their large damage numbers. So you really need to be able to clear both. But of course, even that's not enough. The last part is you must be able to survive all boss relentless phases, and that includes flying bosses. And that in particular can be quite tough. It's, I would say, one of the main reasons why Covenant 25, compared to even just going down one Covenant, Covenant 24, that extra 1,000 HP onto Seraph is a big deal for a lot of builds that can handle most of the other bosses just fine, but then when it comes to Seraph, just don't have the sustain to deal with that large health pool. So everything when you're building, and of course all of these builds that I'm going to show off here, are designed around being able to cover these 3 basic criteria. Okay, and then moving on from there, again, we're going to do 1 build per clan. This time we're focusing on the exiles, so it's going to be 1 build per exile clan or per exile champion. I will talk about not only the clan in context of itself, but also what to do with secondary clans for each one of the builds. There will be a full example run in the description. So yeah, if you check the description, you can see a full run showing off how I typically run builds like the ones I'm showing. And with that, let's just jump into it. We're going to start off with the first of the Exile champions, the Shardtail Queen with Hellhorned. And we're going to talk about the Imperial March build. So the Imperial March build is a hybrid build. It uses a hybrid of Imp Parade and Imperialist. My preferred setup is Imp Parade 2 and Imperialist 1. You can do the reverse with Imperialist 2 and Imp Parade 1, but I often find that the Queen's Imp is just not that valuable, especially when you get into the later parts of the run. So again, my preference, Imp Parade 2, Imperialist 1, but you can do the reverse, and it can still work okay. The core strategies that you use, the imps for the wave clear. So you take Imperialist to get that backline access. And then you have the fledgling imps to scale up damage. What that means is the fledgling imps will help to get you the damage to kill the frontliners. And then as long as the imps are surviving and the Shardtail Queen survives, then you have consistent backline clear. So again, that means the main strengths of the build are you have very, very strong backline clear, and you have potential scaling built into the build without any other supporting cards for scaling. Main weakness is front-loaded damage can be really tough, especially early. I mean, you get fledgling imps. Fledgling imps only give 6 damage unless you have rage buffs, which isn't really going to be enough to kill a lot of these 150, 190 health units. The other main issue is sustain. Because of the way the action trigger works and basically how that comes into play with the Imperialist is the Queen has to be in the front because oftentimes the imps are going to die if you play them in the front. And if you're front lining with the Queen, she takes a lot of damage and she dies, and then suddenly you have no backline clear. So that can be really tough, is how do I make sure to not only have the imps I need and the scaling I need, but how do I make sure that the Queen doesn't die? So we're going to talk about how you can flex picks from other clans or flex in stuff from Hellhorn to try to fix a lot of these weaknesses. In terms of Seraph difficulty, so 1 being basically no different than any other boss, 5 being like brutally difficult. Let's start with Chaste. So Chaste, the main issue with Chaste is that your primary means of scaling is going to be with fledgling imps, and they don't give enough rage to overcome the cleanse effect from Seraph. It's different than something like, for example, Wrathful Hornbreaker Prince's Revenge Trigger, or any of like the larger rage spells that are giving like 5, 10 or so on rage. When you're only getting 3 rage per unit, and that's getting cleansed, then you get into like the final 3 floors. That's only really like 9 rage you're going to get out of a fledgling imp. That's really not enough to get enough damage to start at least feeling confident in killing Seraph. So that one tends to be quite difficult. Not impossible, but certainly the most or one of the most difficult ones for this build. Diligent is very, very easy. The main advantage here is that you're mostly playing units, and ideally you mix in some endless units so that your card draw is primarily units. It's units that you're generating out of the Queen, it's units that you have on endless, and between all of that, you're just not going to be drawing a lot of the garbage so often, and you just don't have as many spells in general. And the other part that's really nice is the units are free. So even if you do end up drawing a lot of the garbage, you're not too worried about it, and you're not going to get garbage generated out of the units because you have such consistent wave clear, or backline clear. So I find Diligent tends to be extremely easy with this build. The main thing is just the sustain, but even there, you don't have big damage units coming out of Diligent, so it tends to be pretty easy. Temperament can be difficult. It's really just about sustain. If you have good ways to make sure your Queen's not going to die, it's a pretty easy fight, because you have so much rage that the sap doesn't really affect you that much. But again, the biggest problem is those backliners that do ×2 multi-strikes. If you don't have a good way to either block or keep the Queen alive, she'll get burst out in sometimes 1 wave, but oftentimes in 2 waves. So that could be pretty challenging, but as long as you have a way to protect her, then you're going to be just fine. Patient really depends. I mean, I put 4, but the biggest problem is it's similar to Temperament. It's getting burst out by Seraph himself. The other part that's really difficult is that because you're playing so many units and your build is so reliant on units, you end up getting a lot of rally triggers, and all of a sudden Seraph's easily going to ramp up to like 35, 40 base damage, and that becomes very, very difficult to deal with. So the rally triggers become difficult. Again, there are ways to play around it. And there are ways to make Patient basically nullified. The biggest one in Hellhorn is, what is it called? The Ascend and Days for 2. Sorry, considering how long I've played this game, I should remember all the card names. But yeah, if you can Ascend and Days 2, that's a way to deal with it. And then there are other methods through the other clans. But if you don't have one of those and you're just playing like raw units with only a handful of supporting spells can be pretty brutal to try to manage patient. All right, let's continue. Unit priorities. So number one is Transcendent. I think that's makes sense, right? You have fledgling imps that you're getting every turn. You have the Queen's Implings that you start with. You hopefully took something like a Welder Helper or something else that can help throughout the run. And then Transcendent just completely scales that up to infinity. Priority then is Endless. Get Endless on this unit as quickly as possible, and it will make a lot of the problems with the build just evaporate. You get so much damage scaling because of the compounding of the rage that you're getting from all the fledgling imps you're generating. Plus, if you end up getting a Welder Helper along the way, then it just gets really insane. You have all the sustain and rage built into one unit. So it's not an auto win, but it certainly helps alleviate a lot of the weaknesses of the build. Second is Deranged Brute. Deranged Brute tends to be really good to get scaling. It's not going to help your sustain as much, but during relentless fights, if you're doing, rather than 2 damage per rage, you're doing 5 damage per rage. Now even chased becomes a little bit more manageable because the scaling is now ramped up quite a lot. So you don't have to sustain as long as you're not dying to waves. You don't have to fight as many rounds with Seraph because you're doing that much more damage. Consumer of Crowns, when you have so many imps, what often makes sense is that you have a second floor where you can just dump a couple of imps to prepare for Consumer of Crowns. You typically have in builds like this more imps than you can fit with a Shardtail Queen anyway. So yeah, getting a Consumer of Crowns slotted in there can helps out primarily with damage, but I mean even a little bit of sustain. It's not a slouch when it comes to health either. So pretty good unit all around in this type of build where you have so many imps in play. And then, as I already mentioned, Welder Helper. Welder Helper it's not mandatory, but it helps tremendously with the sustain. Getting an Endless Welder Helper on this build in particular becomes really good because it acts both as a sustain, but then also backline clear. And especially during things like, for example, Temperament, you can actually block with a Welder Helper and it will absorb 2 or 3 hits, oftentimes the frontliner and then one of the 2 times multi-strikers, which could keep your queen alive, and then you put a few imps behind the queen and suddenly you're fine. So there's a lot of flexibility with Welder Helpers in this build because of the fact that it's going to die at the end of the turn, which is often the problem with Welder Helpers. They get they stick around forever, but when you have Imperialist, it's going to be gone. So jumping into spells, starting with damage, Ritual of Battle. This is an old Ritual of Battle, sorry about that. It's now apply rage 10. That's what it should say. But yeah, just being able to get rage scaling a little bit faster certainly is good. You want to make it lower cost. I would prefer, my preference is to make it lower cost rather than double stack it. But, if you have primarily just imps and you're not using a lot of other spells, then go ahead, -1, double stack it, and you'll be just fine. Or if you have other ways to generate Ember, it can be really good. But just, it helps to get that scaling a little bit faster, especially early game when you haven't ramped up as much. This is an immediate 20 damage onto a unit, and if it's a multi-striker, 40 damage. So tends to be really good to just help that scaling. Last Stand is a finisher. Great finisher for Seraph. You hold it, you get permafrost on it, you're stacking up all that rage, and then right before Relentless, you dump all that rage to a Last Stand, double it, and it can help a lot with Relentless combat, where this build sometimes can get weak if you don't have, consistent Welder Helpers or Transcendence or anything like that. Impelate. The nice thing about Impelate is that it gets stronger the longer the fight goes. So at the beginning, maybe you have your 5 imps, maybe you've picked up a Welder Helper, maybe a Transcendent even. You have something like 7 imps to start with. Even just the base 7 is going to be over 100 damage. But then as you're generating imps, it continues to increase. It's based off of your total imps that are in both your consume pile, your draw pile, your deck, and on the board. So the total imps everywhere are going to contribute. You can easily get an Impelate that has more than 200 damage by the end of a fight, which is really, really good for bursting out units. I often will -1 and hold over just to make sure I have that burst, and potentially also, you burst out a unit that's going to hit your queen and kill her. So tends to be really flexible, really good. Yeah, and it's going to consistently have high damage in builds like this. One Horn's Tome. One Horn's Tome is another way to ramp up. The caution here is that you will absolutely need to have a welder helper. Do not take this unless you have armor. It's too dangerous. There's too much sweep. There's too much spikes, all kinds of stuff that can ruin your day. But if you have armor scaling at all, then One Horn's Tome tends to be really good. And it's pretty easy to get played as long as you have something like a Pyre Chomper, or, I mean, you can always just -2 from it. There's a lot of flexibility there. But if you get like a Pyre Chomper, then double stacking it, because you don't double stack Fragile, you're only going to double stack the multi-strike. That tends to be pretty good. Looking at Sustain, basic Fortify, I mean, it's not the best, but it can do in a pinch. Where this becomes more valuable is things like you can fortify an imp in the front to absorb the hits, but then also it doesn't die, so then it can do some damage, and then it does the damage from the action trigger. So you can get a lot of like combo potential there. And that's one of the things that I would say you should try to do in the build if possible, is mix in imps doing damage and then getting killed by the action trigger. It tends to work best with Melting Remnant, and we'll talk about that later. But even without Melting Remnant, looking for opportunities to get little bits of damage out of your imps before they get yeeted by the queen tends to be really strong. March of Shields, just a better version, and it's flexible in that you can do things like pull imps to the front. You can do things like pull enemies to the front. There's a lot of flexibility here with March of Shields. And the base armor is just better. It's double what you get out of Fortify. Alloy of the Ancients. Yeah, I mean, it's just a simple way to get some pretty solid sustain. I like that it consumes. I would typically not remove consume from it. There is, you could do something like -1 and stack stone, but normally I just leave it as is. Take it. It's a 1 cost. You play it 1 time, you get it out, and it's the nice thing about it is that you can actually use it on backliners too. So if you're worried about, for example, you take One Horn's Tome, and you're worried about your backliner dying to sweep or spikes, you toss an Alloy of the Ancients, and suddenly it's not such a big deal. And finally, Branding Right. Branding Right is, I think, one of the best sustained cards in the game. For this particular, for armor, it's very, very strong. Your queen has a lot of base health, so the piercing doesn't really matter that much. You can pierce. You take a lot of Branding Rights before she's going to die, and that armor will come in tremendously handy during relentless combat. And it also doubles as a backline clear in like an emergency situation. Okay, let's jump into artifacts. First artifact, Collection of Tails. I mean, you have Rage. It's built into the deck. If it doesn't decay, all the better. I can't remember the name right now, but it's a stone that increases the amount of. You know what I'll do? Just in case things like this come up, I'll have it open in the logbook, and I'll turn off the sound really quick. And that way, when I get into artifacts that I can't remember the names of, I can quickly just jump over. Resonant Shard. So Resonant Shard increases your rage scaling by 1. It's similar to a Deranged Brute, but obviously not as impactful as a Deranged Brute, but still really strong. Getting 3 out of your rage is pretty good. That changes it from +6 per Fledgling Imp to +9 per Fledgling Imp, which is certainly much stronger. Consume Crown. Again, it's all about scaling. One thing to note though, and maybe I'm wrong, I need to check this before I say for certain. I'm pretty sure that the action trigger also triggers Consume Crown because it's coming from the queen, but someone maybe in the comments or can validate that. But I'm pretty sure that it also triggers off of the action trigger. So then you get all that extra damage onto the queen. Alternatively, you have other units killing things and they can scale off of that as well. It's not as good as the other two, but it can get some extra damage here or there, which might be relevant for especially the relentless combats. Looking into sustain. Oh, whoops, one more. Gurg's Goad. Gurg's Goad is fantastic and makes the demons playable. Most of the demons are not playable or very strong without it. Exception here would be the Consumer of Crowns. But with Gurg's Goad, all of a sudden the imps, or not the imps, the demons become a lot better, and you can start playing you start playing demons along the same floor as your Shardtail Queen, or even to pull up a second floor with demons and imps as a support floor. Okay, now into sustain. We start with the, what is it? The rail hammer. Should have been easy. It is a hammer. Rail hammer. So rail hammer increases the amount of armor you get every time it's applied. One thing to note is that the armor that's in addition does not get increased by stackstone. So only the base armor gets increased by stackstone, and then this is always on top of that. But still really, really strong. It makes like certain builds absolutely out of control and makes any build that has armor a little bit better, sometimes a lot better. I mean, your fortify is almost double. And if you get something like Stygian Guard, then it just gets out of control. But even just base, it's just really, really good. Makes all of your armor gain that much better. You have, what is this? Steel, Scorched Steel. So Scorched Steel adds +5 armor every time the unit, or every time you play a unit. Sorry, let me say that again. It adds 5 armor to units when they get played. That is the right way to say that. Which can be really good for the imps. That means your imps have the possibility of actually blocking for the Shardtail Queen, which again, if they're in the front, that means that they can do an attack before the action trigger, because the action triggers when the Shardtail Queen has her turn. And so they'll attack, then she will do her action trigger, and then she will attack, and then it will continue down the line. So a great way to get some extra damage out, and a great way to also improve the sustain on the Queen. Similar, basically for the exact same reasons, hammered chest plates is a way to also keep your imps a little bit healthier. I mean, it makes everything a little bit healthier, but then also being able to frontline with imps on occasion to block damage and to get some damage out of them. When it comes to utility, number 1 is Ashes of the Fallen. Ashes of the Fallen is just going to make everything smoother for this build. It is the number 1 priority pick. You should pick it over everything else if you take Shardtail Queen at all, but especially with this type of build where you're relying on the rage scaling, it's going to make everything so much easier. Double armor, double rage, double transcendence. It's just good all around. Similar, but maybe just slightly behind, is Imsicle. Imsicle is also fantastic. Especially when you have Imp Parade, because they're all free. I really think that this is where like the combination becomes absolutely out of control. If you get Imsicle and Ashes of the Fallen, it's obviously insane. But even just Imsicle in a build like this, where the imps have a way to die every turn, because that's often one of the problems with Imsicle, is you have too many imps and they don't die, and then you're getting imps that you can't play. But this is one of those builds where you can consistently play them. And yeah, tends to be really, really strong. You can get some really nutty stuff. I mean, you can actually get Transcend Imps directly out of Imsicle. So really, really good. Fantastic relics. These two are easily the top 2 picks if you can get them. Then you have the Queen's Tail. Sorry. The Queen's Tail. Queen's Tail is okay. It's certainly not as good as the other 2, but it is a nice way to get some extra value out of your imps when you play them. They are a way to deal with Ember Drain as well. So like if you're playing against Chaste and you get all that Ember Drain, your imps are going to be free and they're going to generate Ember for you and generate draw. Again, it's just the first imp played, so it's not everyone, but even then it can be a way to get enough Ember to start playing other stuff as well. So like for example, if you have an Endless imp, I guess Endless imps were fine because you'd play them on the floor anyway. But let's imagine that you had a second floor where you wanted to play Transcend Imp, for example. This would be a way to generate Ember on the floor with the Queen, and then you could play your Transcend Imp afterward on a separate floor. And last is Hell's Banners. Again, you're having all these imps come out. They're often going to be free. They're going to generate a lot of Ember, and then you could do some really nutty stuff if you have X cost cards or just high cost cards. Things like One Horn's Tome or... yeah, even some of the heavier Umbra spells, and again, any X cost, they're just going to make them all that much better. Okay, let's talk about just general gameplay. So my recommendation, take extra capacity. I would almost always take extra capacity in a build like this. It's one of the things that you're going to run into. I would not necessarily take 2 of extra capacity because I think draw also becomes very important. But yeah, extra capacity just means more imps on the floor. And even if you're playing like 2 or 3 floors, you'll find that builds like this tend to take up a lot of space because of how many single units you have. And that, I mean, that just increases the damage, right? So the more imps you can play on the floor, the more AoE you're going to do. And even if you use it instead, not for imps, but have a solid backliner on the same floor, it's also going to be very useful. I mentioned this already several times, but just a reminder, yes, you get imp spawns, but when you have a guaranteed way to lose your imps through Imperialist, getting Endless is fantastic. It's that puzzle piece that often other Shardtail Queens don't have if you don't play Imperialist, where you can guarantee that the imps are going to be gone, which is, again, often a problem. How do you get rid of all these imps that are stacking up behind your queen? You don't have torches. You might be playing, worst case, Melting Remnant with dregs. And how do you get rid of them? This is the way you get rid of them, and then getting Endless on them makes total sense. I typically do a 2-floor. Sometimes 3-floor, but usually if I do a 3-floor, it's literally an imp dump floor and then two, your Shardtail Queen floor, who's doing all the AoE, and then another floor which is for Relentless. That's often what I will end up doing. You can play single floor. It's a little bit awkward because typically you're going to have at least like 3 imps to play, and then if you have a draft unit plus the queen plus 2 or 3 imps, it's hard to fit them all. And if you have 2 draft units, then you're basically already needing a second floor. So I would recommend it. 2 floors. Leave the 3rd floor open for just dumping imps if you end up having too many in your hand at one time, and I think you'll be just fine. And then if you would normally just pick which of the 2 you can when you start. But if you get both, I would preference Imp Parade. I think Imp Parade is a little bit better early game. Imperialist is also quite good, but I would say Relentless can become a problem because you don't have a lot of burst, and the damage numbers on the Shardtail Queen are not that high. But with Imp Parade, you can actually block with a bunch of imps. You get a little bit more damage, and you can consistently play them. So like if you play on the top floor, you could get like 3 or 4 imps hitting the boss before it even reaches the top floor, which you struggle to do often with Imperialist. Talking about secondary clans, we'll start with Awoken. Number 1 would be Animus of Will. Animus of Will just scales so hard with Rage. It's insane. Nothing really much to say about that. It's one of your ways to deal with the major weakness of the build, which is killing frontliners. If you have an Animus of Will, it becomes less of a problem. And Relentless, when you have all that much Rage, it means less attacks from bosses. Certainly, I would recommend you add health onto the Animus of Will to try to deal with spikes and sweep and that kind of stuff. But yeah, just a fantastic overall unit for this build. Really fits that niche and takes care... Niche? Fits the niche of the build and takes advantage of all of those fledgling imps. Regen. So regen's is a little bit weird. It can work really well with the Shardtail Queen. However... armor is typically better, but if you don't get armor, if you don't get a welder helper, and if you don't get any armor spells, and you even start with standard Awoken, so you have restores as your basic card, do regen, and you can stack up enough regen to keep her alive through most of the fights. Again, armor is my preference, but as secondary, certainly regen can work. Adaptive Mutation is very, very good in this build. So if you're not aware about how Adaptive Mutation works, Adaptive Mutation swaps your health and your damage, but when it does the swap, it takes into account all status effects, both positive and negative. So it'll take your sap, it'll take your rage, it'll take, there's a few other fringe cases, but basically those are the main 2. And it will add that to the total, which is being swapped for your health. So then you get your damage plus buffs on your health, and your health becomes your damage, but then it's also buffed by your buffs. Your buffs don't go away. And so if you can play Adaptive Mutation like 2 or 3 times, every time you do the swap, your status effect gets added to your health and damage. So it ends up scaling really, really hard later on into the game, or even earlier. With a build like this where you're going to consistently get fledgling imps very early, even after like 2 or 3 fledgling imps, it ends up being really valuable. And finally, Emblem of Exiles. Again, just a fantastic relic for sustain. Easily the best relic for Awoken in terms of just broad use. But yeah, getting Emblem of Exiles can be really good for the queen. It can also be really good if you have two floors, right? So then you have your floor with the queen, who's killing most of the things, and then you have your Relentless floor who's slowly building up, but in addition, building up extra health. One thing you just got to watch out for is you don't accidentally increase the health on an imp on another floor, and then you have an imp that's getting really tanky. That can be kind of awkward. But apart from that one case, it tends to be really, really strong. Next is Stygian Guard. So with Stygian Guard, one of the really great picks here is going to be Frenzied Swarm. The main reason why, again, is sustain. If you have Frenzied Swarm, you can play all your imps in the front. They can all do their damage, and then they all die to the action trigger. This just completely negates a lot of the main issues with the build. You're still going to have to find a way to kill big frontline units, but it alleviates a lot of the pressure on the queen to survive and sustain through all the fights, and allows you to get a little bit more damage. I mean, it can scale up, right? If you have 3 or 4 imps that you're playing, and they all get a fledgling imp, that could be something like 24, 25, or 24 damage out of imps. So could be really strong. But basically, yeah, Daze is going to be a way to keep her safe through the entire run up until Relentless. Best if you can get holdover on it, or Stackstone if you're going for Relentless, but holdover otherwise. Unnamed Tome basically negates Patient. if you get one named Tome with this build, you win. I mean, it's the units are so much less difficult than other units and other builds. The first few waves of enemies are so weak. The scare is just melee weakness, and you can just negate melee weakness by tanking with an imp instead. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and yeah, just makes it insanely easy. So if you have Patient, get Unnamed Tome. Don't even think about it. Just snap pick it. There's not going to be anything better you're going to get. Incant. So Incant can be a little awkward, to be honest, because you start off with mostly units, and then it can get even worse if you end up with like mostly units and then foregone powers. Then you have like almost no incants. So again, recommendation here, get holdover on maybe 2 or 3 spells so that you can guarantee you're going to have something you can play to incant if you need it. I don't typically do incants, but it can work where you have the queen's floor, you have an incant floor. I mean, some nice things you can get there is some of the imp-based spells. If you can play them on the same floor, it can be really strong. But yeah, just note that incant can be difficult, and the best way to deal with that is just get holdover on a few spells that are consistently good for that floor. Spell weakness. Spell weakness can actually be really strong in the build. Again, I would say out of the two, my typical run when I have Queen's builds with Stygian is to use the Queen for Relentless and for the Wave Clear, and then get massive burst spells. And one thing that you can actually do that's quite strong is you can get like an Icy Silophyte, put her behind the Queen, do all your stuff with AoE, killing everything, and then during Relentless, you stack up all of the spell weakness, and then you like blast with huge spells to kill the boss. Can work really, really well with this build. One of the few builds that I think actually spell weakness can be very, very, very strong. Okay, next up is Umbra. Umbra, Shadow Siege. Shadow Siege is very, very playable in Shardtail Queen builds. You're already likely to take extra capacity, and in addition, you get all of these opportunities for Ember. You have Pyre Chomper, you have all of the relics, you have the Umbra spells, you have the Umbra relics. Like, there's a lot more between these two clans to get Ember, and then the fact that by default you're just planning to take extra capacity, you're already kind of set up to do it. So I would say, yeah, if you can, get Shadow Siege. It fits really, really well in the build. It addresses the two main weaknesses, which is burst damage and sustain. So you just have big chunk and Shadow Siege as your win condition. And because you're clearing so consistently, you don't need to get it within the first couple of turns. She'll handle all of the units, you know, in the first few rounds, and then finally when Shadow Siege comes out, he's coming out to basically deal with the bosses. And that tends to work pretty well. Damage shield. If you're gonna do any type of sustain coming from Umbra, I would highly recommend you do damage shield over lifesteal. The main reason why is that like there's so much armor. There's so much armor across the build and opportunities to get armor, but that doesn't synergize at all with lifesteal. Maybe like a branding right to get a little bit of health back, but in my opinion, it's like who cares? Better is to get the damage shield because then you're protecting the armor. So you use the damage shield to protect your armor. You continue to scale up the armor, and there's no conflict. Yeah, you'll get hit a lot. You'll lose damage shield. Damage shield is not always as good as lifesteal when it comes to relentless, but the combination of armor and damage shield tends to be very, very strong because you can scale it up and then protect it with damage shield. Okay. Ember Drain package works, and I mean it works pretty well. You often have ways to generate Ember, even when Ember Drained. We talked about that before. You have things like important work. You have the imps are going to be free anyway, so if you get like Hell's Banners, then you just need to play 2 imps, and suddenly you're back in business with Ember. A lot of opportunities to generate Ember, a lot of Ember generating spells coming out of Umbra. So I feel like it's one of the better Ember Drain packages as well. The harder part is finding the unit that's going to take all of it. I mean, the Queen's okay, especially like Void Binding tends to be really, really good on the Queen. But like, you don't really want Lifesteal. The Rage you're going to get from units anyway. I guess it's fine. You get a little bit more Rage. Furnace Tap is, I mean, in general, pretty good on the Queen. So I mean, it's good. The hardest part is just finding which unit to play everything onto. But yeah, the fact that you can overcome a lot of the Ember Drain issues very easily tends to make it very strong in the build. And yeah, take capacity. I mean, we talked about it already, but just take extra capacity and you'll be happy. Last up, Melting Remnant. Reform Remnant Pact. I love it. It's a way to get imps that slowly get stronger and then they can frontline. And it's really, really cool to have all of these like Queen's Implings that have, 11, 16, even more health occasionally that are all frontlining for the Queen, doing huge damage and then blowing up to kill the back line. Fantastic combination. It's my favorite combination with Shardtail Queen, just because it's also hilarious having these massive imps that are doing tons of damage. Still has a problem during Relentless, so you have to be a little bit cautious about Relentless. But one of the nice things is if you've been regenerating the same imps over and over again, and you play the Shardtail Queen maybe on like floor 1 or 2 or room 1 or 2, then you can bring back some of these big chonky imps onto the next floors to fight during Relentless. So there's a lot of opportunities there. But yeah, I really like it. I think it's fantastic. I think Reform is typically a little bit better, but even just getting Endless on like a Transcend imp can be really, really strong. And Wickless Baron Big Sludge. Ooh, boy, do they love this build. Yeah. A lot of death, a lot of carnage. Backliners are dying, imps are dying, and they just go to town. So yeah, very, very good for any type of harvest. And obviously, yeah, you can get the Tycoon if you want, but Baron Big Sludge. Stealth. Stealth is also pretty good, similar to Daze. It's just a way to protect the Queen and to guarantee your imps can survive. I prefer to take it via the spell rather than via the Molten Encasement, just because you take up 1 capacity with the Molten Encasement, whereas you can just, play the spell over and over again, and that tends to work a little bit better. But either can work. Yeah, I mean, it's just really good. The nice thing about Stealth, too, compared to Daze, is you don't have to worry about, like, when the boss comes. You can just stack it up as much as you want ahead of time, and it's already there when the boss comes. So, really like it. It's a really good way to sustain through a lot of the fights. Oh. Next up is Wyldenten with the Rat Trap build. One of my favorite builds in the game to play. I think it's hilarious. It's really fun, and it's fairly straightforward. The pilot can be difficult, but we'll talk about exactly why in just a minute. Champion choice here is Strangler 1 or 2 with Predator 1 or 2. I think my preference is Strangler 1 with Predator 2 because then you get the multi-strike. But honestly, Strangler 2 is also fine because you get more health and a little bit higher base damage. So maybe it kind of evens out. But as I said, for me, typically Predator 2 is better. And the idea here is that you use Wyldenten to block all units from reaching the pyre, and in the meantime, you prepare for Relentless. And there's a couple of different ways that you do that. The main thing is that you have this like incredibly strong backline clear, right? Because you get sweep from Strangler. And then because you're rooting every time, the units can never actually make it to the pyre. The reason why you flex in Predator is one, because Strangler's base stats all the way up to 3 are just kind of bad. And I don't really love Thornlord with it. The main advantage of having Predator is that you're killing the backliners before they hit you. So when you're playing against things like Seraph the Temperate or Seraph the Patient, you can kill off the high damage units before they have a chance to actually do any damage. Whereas if you take Thornlord, you get the 3 stings, but it's not really helping you with clearing the backline. And that's really the big problem oftentimes with Wyldenten builds is backline. Major weakness is you don't really have very good sustain. Wyldenten with this hybrid setup has pretty low health, and that can be very problematic. As well, the damage is not that high. Yes, let's say you go Predator 2, you get multi-strike. It's still not like you're doing insane amounts of damage. I think its base is like 20 or 30 damage. It's not really a lot. So Relentless can be very, very difficult. There's also this, it doesn't happen super often, but it can happen that if you're not killing units consistently, you might start to get overflow. So overflow is when you have too many units on the floor, so too many enemy units on the floor. When they try to move, they will actually bypass the floor. So during some Seraph fights, if you are not able to just clear off all the big tanks are going to start skipping, which is really, really bad. That means you're going to start taking a lot of pyre damage. So it's low natural sustain, it's Relentless, and then it's this potential to overflow that can all be really problematic. In terms of Seraph difficulty, Chased is either pretty easy or pretty hard. It really depends on how you are getting sustained. If you're sustaining through things like armor or through like enhancing with extra stats or even like stealth, they're all pretty good. If you're sustaining through regen or through lifesteal or damage shield, then it can become very, very difficult very quickly. So again, it really depends on the method, but could be quite easy, could be quite hard. The other part too is the Ember Drain. If you're not able to kill the units very quickly, Ember Drain will start to pile up because it'll stack on top of itself. So that's something to be wary of as you get like 2 or 3 of those Ember Drain units on the floor. They're going to stack and you're going to get like lots of Ember Drain very quickly. Diligent, it really depends on how reliant you are on spells. Or how many spells you have is probably even a better way to say it. If you have a ton of spells, you're probably going to be okay. And one of the nice things about Wyldenten is that he comes with root seeds, which means you're going to have more draw, which means you're going to draw more of your spells. It also means you're going to draw more blights, so it could be kind of difficult. The one nice thing though is you really never have to worry about the units that put garbage in your deck, the blights, because Wyldenten's going to kill them before they have a chance to hit you. Temperate, it's basically, if you get Predator, it's easy. If you don't, it's very hard. But if you get Predator, it's basically a cakewalk because you kill all of the damage. And then when we just saw in the last battle, the other units do 10 damage. It's pretty easy to sustain through. Yes, you still have to worry about Relentless, but in terms of like actually dying before Seraph, pretty unlikely. Patient can be brutal. Depending on how you're setting things up, can be pretty brutal. The biggest problem with Patient is that you can't stop Patient from hitting you, if that makes sense, right? So like you get melee weakness, Patient's gonna hit you. You can't quick your way out of it unless you have something like stealth or damage shield. You could be in trouble very quickly. Regen is probably not going to sustain you. Armor is a little bit tight with Seraph the Patient. Lifesteal's okay if you have enough base health, but it can get really scary very quickly. In terms of priorities, number 1 is Animus of Will. With Predator, Animus of Will can oftentimes clear frontliners. What you want in that case is, you pretty much always have to take some type of base health just to deal with spikes and sweep. But then all the root seeds go on her. You get hopefully you get a razor sharp edge, steel enhancers, and she is your scaler to try to deal with all the frontline burst while Wyldenten clears the back line. Husk Hermit's also pretty good. It's a decent way to tank as well. It's got, I mean, it's not got high health, but it's got decent health. If you put some health stones on it, it's pretty good. Normally, I would not take other sweep units, but out of the sweeps, it's certainly going to be the better one. You can also frontline with the other, with the I can't think of what it's called right now, but the sweep unit that gains damage as it hits, but it's a little sketch because of the low health total. Vine Mother, I actually like quite a lot. One, it draws, and two, it's actually like you can just play it on the top floor and it doesn't get hit forever, and you just keep generating stings. And if you have any type of sting synergy, it's a pretty good way to kill frontliners. And then last is Awoken Hollow. So Awoken Hollow has this very specific caveat. You don't play it on the same floor. You use it as a scaler. So you do something like you have Wyldenten on one floor. You put Awoken Hollow plus Animus of Will on a separate floor. You get any form of rejuvenation trigger. That's one of the problems is you don't start with one because you have root seeds. But you get something like Unleash the Wildwood or Awake or Wildwood Sap, and then you can buff up the Animus of Will on a separate floor or buff up another unit. You can play them on the same unit, so you could put like a Woken Hollow in front of Predator. You take one capacity, fit them both on the same floor, and you could scale that way as well. So there's some opportunities. I would never take Thorned Hollow in Wyldenten builds, and I would never take most of the other, like the Channelers, I don't think are very good either. So this is kind of what you get. And especially if you're taking Predator, then you wouldn't get Animus of Speed either because you just already have Quick, so you don't need another Quick. You don't get to be extra quick because you have 2 Quicks. In terms of spells, enhancements are going to be big. So Razor Sharp Edge, Steel Enhancer, Cycle of Life, all very, very good at stacking HP, or well, Razor Sharp Edge not so much at HP, but stacking stats, which is just in general very, very good in these builds. If you take Predator 2, you can get Multi-Strike, and then they all get even more value. But Sweep in general gets value from stat buffs. And then Cycle of Life is really just to bump up Wyldenten's health so that you can deal with Relentless a little bit better. The other is Sharpen. Sharpen's kind of a mixed bag. It can work, but spikes are a little bit weird with Root and Sweep. So I wouldn't necessarily take Sharpen, but if you have like an Animus of Will, Sharpen tends to be pretty good there because you can stack a lot of damage very quickly. It's 12 base damage. Or if you have, what is it called? The artifact, Gnarled Root, then it's also okay because you're getting the double benefit. You get +8 damage per application instead of just +4, and that can be very strong. In terms of sustain, Unleash the Wildwood's really good here because I don't think regen tends to work very well, but being able to just heal to full after every round. So you get like endless on it, or not endless, you get holdover on it, and then you can just automatically heal. If you end up going with something like an Awoken Hollow, this is a fantastic trigger for it. It also heals it to full. So there's some opportunities there, but in general, I like it because it's a kind of a surefire way to make sure you're not going to die until Relentless, and then you just have to concern yourself with how do we survive Relentless. Restoration Detonation is a way to heal and then also do burst damage, which is one of the main weaknesses again. It's hard to get a lot of front-loaded burst damage onto front units, and then the fact that it has some heal built in is also quite good. Focus Growth, it's a pretty decent heal. It comes with some draw. It's not the best, but it can work in a pinch if you need some healing. And then finally, Awake. Again, I don't normally go for regen, but Awake also heals 30 base, which can be very good, right? So just being able to heal. If you do take Awake, go -1 or -2. Don't take anything else. Don't do 2 holdover. Just get -2 so that you can play it for 1, heal for 30. Yeah, I mean, that's it. The problem is that a lot of the spells in Awoken don't synergize particularly well apart from the enhancements. and none of them are going to be really what sustains you. You're going to be looking at your secondary clan as your main way of sustain. Okay, so what do we get for relics? There's the Sting package. Whole idea here is all of your stings become way better. You get them every turn. They can pierce. They get plus 30 damage. And that, I mean, if you can, obviously you don't always get all three, but even getting some pieces of stings can help deal with the frontliners. Especially if you get piercing, then you can deal with armored frontliners that they're not blocking all your hits. And in general, Thorn Fruit's always good just because it's like a guaranteed +1 draw every turn. Eventually, your deck becomes oversaturated. It's also like a good way to just kind of consistently have zero cost things to play, which synergize well with a lot of the other clans as well. In addition, and then as like Seraph the Diligent, it's just a guaranteed Seraph the Diligent consume card you get every turn. Then you have Sustain Synergy. With Emblem of Exile, Sap Tap, the Cloak. These all help in like different ways. I mean, Emblem of Exile is just the best of all of them because you just naturally gain extra health, which you need to be able to survive during relentless combat. Sap Tap just turns your heals into draw. So if you get something like Unleash the Wildwood on holdover, or you get an Awake or anything like that, then you're just going to get an extra draw every turn, which is always very good. And then Priory's Cloak, if you do have something again like Unleash the Wildwood, that turns Unleash the Wildwood into not just a heal spell, but a damage spell, which can be very valuable. But Emblem of Exiles would be the priority across all. Emblem of Exiles, and then I would say after that, get like Thorn Fruit. Other utility, Lights, what is it called? Lights, sorry, I've got to go jump into the logbook really quick. We'll turn off sounds as well. Light's Gift is what it's called. So yeah, so then Light's Gift is really good because you can then play on the top floor and you're guaranteed that at least the first time units show up, they're not going to hit you. That's one turn of not getting hit, one turn where you sustain a little bit better. And for bosses, then the bosses also have one turn where they're also dazed, which can be really valuable. Winged Indulgence. Just to reduce damage. It's one of those builds where you're not really worried about taking damage. Or so let me say that again. You're not trying to take damage, so Winged Indulgence can be really good to just, again, reduce how much damage you're taking. I mean, that Seraph means -3 per rotation, which, again, it's not a lot, but it can make the difference in some cases. And then Concussive Coals, very similar to Light's Gift. Daze is very, very good at just helping to enable you to have one more turn. So then if you have Concussive Coals, you would play on the bottom floor instead. All right, let's talk about general gameplay tips. So there are basically two ways to set up. One is you go all in on a single floor. I find that to be very, very challenging, but it can work. One of my favorite builds is a single floor build. We'll talk about that when we get to secondary clans. But it's always going to be the challenge of getting enough damage and getting enough sustain if you're playing a single floor. The other setup, which is also very, very strong, is to do a 2-floor setup where Wyldenten stalls. So it's literally just there to keep units there while you build up a second floor. And that can be like an incant floor, a gorge floor, an enhanced floor, the Awoken Hollow floor. But then you build that up for Relentless, and Wyldenten's literally just keeping units away from hitting that top floor. Both methods work pretty well. They have different drawbacks, but I think it really depends on what units you get, which way you end up going. Biggest problem here is sustain. If you think about it in like this way, like sustain is damage. It's and in reverse, damage is sustain. With this particular build, basically units will only make it as far as your Wyldenten survives. So as long as Wyldenten lives, you will never take pyre damage. And so then it's all about how do you make Wyldenten live as long as possible. And that can be by just getting insane amounts of damage. With Predator, you're killing things before they kill you. Or vice versa, you get insane amounts of sustain and you can just tank forever. Those are kind of the two methods if you're not going to do this kind of 2-floor setup. And very likely you need to take at least one capacity. The nice thing is, because you have Root Seeds as your starter card, Draw Relic is not as mandatory as it often is with other builds. So taking the extra capacity can be very, very helpful. It's mandatory if you could do like an Awoken Hollow plus Wyldenten, but oftentimes other builds also want one more capacity to fit. Either that you can fit a 3 capacity unit, or that you can fit a 2 capacity in a 1 capacity unit. All right, secondary clans, starting with Hellhorned. Armor can be pretty good. It's the nice thing about armor compared to a lot of the others is, how do I say it? It stacks better than a lot of the other sustain things. Apart from just like adding extra health. It can be especially good against Chase and Temperament, where you're almost guaranteed to kill the backliners, and then you have armor to deal with Relentless. Rage is very good if you get Predator 2 or if you have Animus of Will, and that's one of those cases where then, for example, if you have like a Fledgling Imp, you would want to increase capacity at least 1, so you could have like an Animus of Will, play a Fledgling Imp, have a way to kill it off, and then just keep stacking Rage that way. If you only have Predator 1 and you don't have a multi-striker, then I would avoid Rage. I don't think it's as good of a way to increase as like just then doing enhancements or improving your sustain. But if you have any multi-strike at all, then it can be quite good. Imps, as mentioned, like if you have an extra capacity, you can fit in a Welder Helper or a Fledgling Imp. Transcend Imp can also be, obviously we just saw Transcend Imp can get insane. What you would likely do if you do Imps is that you would have a second floor. So you have your main floor and you have a floor where Imps are buffing something. But maybe you also have just Wyldenten solo and just put Imps. So you just have, maybe you have like Awoken, or not Awoken Hollow. You have Animus of Will on one floor, you have Wyldenten on a separate floor, and you use the Welder Helpers with Wyldenten to like scale up, and use like other imps with the Awoken Hollow. AoE imps can also save some damage, but I find them to be not so great. And then, Impish Scholar, it really depends on whether you have a suitable consume card that you want to consistently bring back. Overstacking is very, very good here. There's another build that I like to do. I'm not showcasing it here, but it's the Fast and Furious, and it's built around Ascend to Descend. So you just get a ton of units, ideally demons that have rage synergy. So you get like Deranged Brutes, you get the Horned Warrior, not Horned Warrior, you get the, what is he called? The Branded Warrior. Gosh, Branded Warrior. And you try to just kill things with Branded Warrior, increase the rage on the whole floor, play Rage Imps, or I guess you can't really play Rage Imps, but you basically do an overstack. You ascend everything up to Wyldenten. They all take advantage of Predator's Quick. Ideally, you also have the sweep, and then you just get a massive floor with tons of raging demons. It can be quite strong. Stygian Guard. Stygian Guard, Frenzied Swarm is your friend. We talked about this with the Shardtail Queen, but very similar. What this creates is what I call the Blinding Rat Trap. So you have basically, you're never going to get hit until Relentless, and then your only other consideration if you get holdover on Frenzied Swarm is just, how am I going to kill the boss? So you can have Frenzied Swarm, and then every other card in your deck needs to be, how do I kill the boss? Because the holdover is going to be enough that you're never going to take damage otherwise. The only thing you have to be concerned about is doing enough damage that you don't have the overflow. But normally, that's not such a big deal. Lodestone Totem, we saw this with Shardtail Queen, but it can work very similar here in this case. And what's especially good about Wyldenten is that, again, you come with Root Seeds. So you're going to get extra draw. You have Root Seeds are like fantastic spells to play on the Wyldenten, and they're going to make all the other units daze. And because they're stuck there, you can continue to stack it forever. It's great with flying bosses, as we just saw. It's great in general. So that's also a way to do it, is you get like one or two lodestone totems, and you just daze everything so that Wyldenten never takes damage. Incant builds are amazing with Wyldenten because of root seeds. Root seeds are the enabler of so much value when it comes to incant. You get the damage, which is good for basically every incant unit, but then in addition, you get the draw. And when you get 0 cost root seeds, then you start to, like, it really gets insane. Sirens are always going to be good, but as I mentioned here, Guardian Stone is a fantastic way to sustain. You put it up front, it sustains itself with all of the armor gain, and then in addition, Wyldenten gets all that armor, plus any other units you can fit. This is again one where you would likely take extra capacity, and then you would have Guardian Stone, you have maybe a Siren, and then you have Wyldenten, and you just scale up with insane amounts of incanting. In this case, you can pivot into Thornlord, but I also don't think you need it. Just sticking with Predator and Strangler absolutely will work with an incant build. And then Titan Sentry. Just put Endless on it. So what you do is you just put Titan Sentry in front, Wyldenten in the back. All the things hit Wyldenten, or all the things hit Titan Sentry, killing themselves, while Wyldenten also does sweep and kills things. Pretty hilarious. Works rather well. Titan Sentry is just such a good unit. It's one of those units that I think probably needs a nerf. I don't know how you nerf it, though, in a way that makes it still playable, but maybe the health total, I don't know. But Titan Sentry with Wyldenten, if you get Endless, is just amazing. Even if you don't get Endless and just do a lot of sustain, like you do like a Guardian Stone with a Titan Sentry and a Wyldenten, is going to be an amazingly strong floor, because bosses will just kill themselves, and that works pretty well. All right, next up, Umbra. So Umbra is where I would recommend a 2-floor strategy. So you have your Wyldenten floor, and then you have your Gorge floor. Your Gorge floor is building up a lot of stats, a lot of buffs, status effects from eating, and then you have your Wyldenten floor that is just stalling for them. So you get like a robot, you get one of the shrouds, and they're going to be your main relentless boss killer. And then you just have Wyldenten there to keep units at bay until it's time. And what's really cool, I don't know if you guys are aware about how root works as well. I think most of you are probably aware, but if you're not, root, if the boss kills Wyldenten and there's still root on the enemy units, they will die. So they will not go up to the next floor. So even if you can't kill all the units, if they're rooted, then when the boss goes up, they just die. They get killed when the floor gets destroyed. So it's another way to just make sure that only a boss is going to show up at the end. As long as Wyldenten survives until the boss shows up, then your top floor, your Gorge floor, can just focus on Relentless. Ember Drain package is also actually pretty good. Rage is pretty good on Wyldenten. Extra multi-strike is going to be good with him, especially if you have Predator. And then, damage shield is also decent. So, Ember Drain package, really solid here as well. Last consideration is just, more space. Again, the more space you have, the more units are taking advantage of the quick incant. So, just take extra space and profit. Last, we have Melting Remnant. So Melting Remnant is my favorite combination for the sneaky rat trap. My favorite build. This really is. This is my favorite build in terms of just hilarity. Like it's so funny to watch for me. Two methods, right? You either do it with a Molten Encasement or you do it with an Engulfed in Smoke, and you get Holdover Endless, and then Wyldenten just kills everything, and there's nothing they can do. They just get mowed over by a stealthy Wyldenten, and it's hilarious. As long as you don't get Overflow, this is like one of the most brain dead builds to play in the game. And the fact that you have two different methods of getting it, either the molten encasement or the engulfed in smoke, and once you get it, you can pretty much deal with relentless. It's not guaranteed, but you'll end up with something like 8 or 9 stealth by the time the boss shows up. And if you have any other way, I mean, you're going to be root seedsing as well. So you're going to be increasing with root seeds. You get the stealth. You should have enough damage to kill most bosses. And by the time you reach Seraph, hopefully you've gotten what you need in order to consistently kill off Seraph. But if you don't, well, I mean, life's tough. But ideally, you're able to do so. Apart from just the hilarity of stealth, Harvest is very good. Every unit's going to die on the same floor. They're going to all die on the Wyldenten floor. Slap either major Harvest unit, so Big Sludge or Harvest Baron, Wickless Baron, and they're going to love being there. They're gonna eat to their heart's content, harvest off of all of these dead enemy units. The best, of course, is that you get a Harvest unit, you get your Wyldenten, you increase capacity, and you fit the tomb. You get a molten encasement, and then they also get benefit from the molten encasement, and you just profit in all possible ways. Burnout is certainly possible. You can do a reinforced burnout build with Paraffin Enforcer, and then like Wicklash with a Predator Wyldenten can work. It's a little scary because you're investing a lot into damage. But if you have sustain, if you have stealth in addition, or if you have regen or health health buffs as well, then it can work quite well. I typically would go with a Harvest. I think is a little bit easier to play, but you can do this burnout setup as well. All right, next up is Solgard the Mighty, which is a Solgard the Martyr build. Solgard the Mighty takes advantage of Titan Channel by either going all in on Titan Channel and going all the way to Titan Channel 3, or by going to Titan Channel 2 and then flexing in one of the other two picks. The idea here is to take advantage of the massive stats out of Titan Channel and then either combo it or use it as just a massive unit. I mean, Titan Channel 3 has the highest base stats of any unit in the game, apart from enemy units. Core strategy. The idea is to take advantage of all of those stats, use it to tank, use it to kill frontliners, and then, either you kill the backliners with Frostbite, with Sweep, Trample if you can get it, but use one of these methods of killing off the backliners, and Titan Channel just is your, big front, tank and big damage dealer. Strengths, obviously very, very high base stats, and it's also very high in terms of flexibility. You can play it in the front, you can play it in the back, you can play it in the middle, depending on what you need. So if you have another tank, like if you have like a Titan Sentry, you can still play it in the middle, or maybe you have like a Guard of the Unnamed, you put in the front, put Solgard in the middle as a way to just kind of deal a bunch of damage. Alternatively, you tank with it, and you can put it on any floor, although I would recommend in general playing it higher up because you have that initial incant requirement. But you can also play on lower floors if you have enough ways to generate incants quickly. Weaknesses is the setup. The setup can be brutal. If you don't have consistent spells, at least 10, within the first couple of rings, you're going to struggle. So just consider that. And as well, if you end up having to pivot, like you pivot into Dire Channel or Cold Channel, it may make the frontline units difficult to kill unless you have other ways of dealing with them, like big damage spells or another big damaging unit. In terms of difficulty, Chased tends to be pretty easy. It's like the buff doesn't really matter as much for the most part. Where Chased becomes more difficult is if you have higher spell costs. Especially like if you don't have a lot of 0 or 1 cost spells, you can get in trouble when you get Ember Drained, and then all of a sudden you're taking all of this Ember Drain and you can't play any of your spells. So it's really dependent again on kind of average spell costs. With Diligent, it's scaling more like on the number of spells you have. If you have enough spells or enough ways to deal with the consume, you're fine. But if you only have like a handful of spells or a lot of holdover spells, you might struggle because they're going to start getting consumed very quickly. Temperament, I put as like kind of an average. The biggest issue being sustaining through all of the multi-strikers. It's not so bad when you have Titan Channel 3, and especially if you have a way to like either heal up or add armor or damage shield or something to Solgard. But if you don't, and you're like rank 2, it can be really problematic. The one nice thing about Temperament with Solgard is that the phased, you don't take any of the stat effects, so you don't get the sap from either getting played or from the sap trigger off of Seraph until after you've come out of phased. Patient is, I find, the most difficult because you with Solgard Titan Channel, you don't have the kind of flexibility you normally get with the other Solgards where it's like, okay, one turn I can't incant on this floor because I'm worried about Patient taking too much damage. But here, it's actually a big deal. Like, you really need to get your incounts out early, and that lack of flexibility on where you play your spells can often mean that you end up cranking Patient up to 11, and then he just kills all your units. So I find Patient to be the most difficult, just because primarily that the incant becomes really difficult, and melee weakness becomes very difficult, especially if you are only at rank 2 Titan Channel. Looking at cards, number 1 priority is Offering Monument. Offering Monument is so good with this build because you need to front load. It's all about front loading those spells, especially if you go rank 3 Titan Channel. You don't need any incants past 15, so just front loading them with an Offering Monument. You're going to find the Offering Monument's going to die around the time that Seraph, or not the Seraph, that Solgard is ready to come out of phased. And that can be a way to just kind of power in that early phase, and then you have Solgard there for the rest of the round. Titan Sentry is also very good as a way to deal with early waves, especially early backliners, while you wait for Solgard to come out of his cocoon. Siren of the Sea, I mean, it's always going to be good. I prefer Siren of the Sea over Nameless Siren in these types of builds, but either one will be just fine. The nice thing about Siren of the Sea is if you can't incant enough to have Solgard show up, she's not going to die right away. That's the one problem with Nameless Siren, is that if Solgard doesn't arrive in time, she might just die to units. So just consider that. Getting a Guardian Stone could also help there, but basically, yeah, my preference is Siren of the Sea out of all of them. And then I really like Cold Celia. Cold Celia is able to deal with backliners similar to Titan Sentry. You get quick on her and enough damage, and especially if you're not dealing with Seraph the Temperament. Then you have a really strong way to deal with backliners, and you have a very, very strong frontliner. And then during Relentless, Cold Celia will stack up all that Frostbite onto the boss, helping you to kill the bosses a little bit more consistently. All right, next up is Stygian spells, starting with utility spells. A lot of these are going to be ones that are helpful for either card draw or for protecting the floor. So Offering Token is very good, especially if you can combo it with an Offering discard. But even if you can't, you can combo it with Offering Monument. You can combo it with a way to get rid of Blights, or Dead Weights. So there's a lot of other uses for it as well. But especially if you can hit it with Offering based spells, then you get basically 2 incants for the price of 1. Unnamed Tome. It's an auto deal with Patient. Suddenly Patient becomes, again, 0.5. It's much, much easier when you don't have to worry about it. And luckily, because you are Stygian, you have a chance to get it with every single one of your runs. Frenzied Swarm. Daze also tends to be really good. You don't, unless you go Cold Channel as your alternate, you don't really need to take any damage, get revenge triggers. So then the Daze can be really good, especially when you get into like Temperament and things like that. That can protect you from those backliners hitting you so hard, and hopefully you're able to deal with the units on your own, even when they're dazed. Siren Song, similarly, just get them out of the floor, never have to worry about getting damaged. Deep Offering is a fantastic way to, again, similar to Offering Monument, front load your incanting. So you play Deep Offering, ideally with a whole bunch of 0 or 1 cost spells or spells that generate Ember, and suddenly you're able to get, a whole bunch of other cards. I mean, you're gonna probably get a lot of foregone powers, but they're all 0 cost as well. But usually you'll get at least 2 or 3 incants in addition to Deep Offering when you play it. For backline clear, Flash Freeze is pretty good. It's the only major targeted damage spell you get out of Stygian Guard, but it works. And the only issue is when you don't have, when you don't have enemy units, then it's less good because you can't incant with it unless you hit your own unit. But if you have units there, then it can be quite good. Ice Storm, I think, is a little bit better because you don't have that requirement. The one issue with Ice Storm is it requires a spell upgrade in order to be useful at all, and it's random, so you can't guarantee it's going to hit the back line. But when you have 5 random hits, and if you have something like plus 20 or plus 10 on it, oftentimes you'll kill the backliners. It's not guaranteed, but it's fairly likely. Ice Tornado is a little bit less likely, and I would say it's like borderline, because it is a way to clear backliners, but it is very, very RNG. But in a pinch, it can work, and it's better than nothing. So the other problem with Ice Tornado is that it's so expensive. So you probably want to make it 1 cost, means 2 Mana Stones, which means you can't increase the damage, which can also be kind of sketch. Last is Titan's Tooth. Titan's Tooth is one of the better ones. You can get Permafrost on it, and then even your foregone powers eventually should hit it. So yeah, I mean, it's a way to get you never want to play this out of your hand unless you have like insane amounts of Ember. You always want to hit it with a discard, and it's very consistent wave clear, especially if you can get like plus 10 or double stack on it. Looking at relics, one of them for some reason is missing. It had an animate. With Incant, the biggest ones are going to be Foregone Power. Let me just jump into my logbook really quick. The Wing Steel, that's right. So Foregone Power, Wing Steel. Foregone Power, obviously, for double incants, makes your threshold drop from 15 to 8 or from 10 to 5. Makes it much, much easier to get Solgard up and running as quickly as you can. Wing Steel is just getting more card draw. It tends to be very, very strong in these builds. And then the Split Anvil. And Split Anvil enables you to have one big costed spell that will then make all of your other spells free, making it much easier to incant them. And in those cases, you can do something like play Titan's Tooth outright, and then all of your other spells become free. Spell damage also tends to be pretty good in these builds, especially like if you can have some of these relics included. So starting with the Totem Fragment. So Totem Fragment will help, especially if you're playing on the top floor, help you to be able to burst out units in case you don't have the damage that you need. It's also really good for any of your AoE spells, like if you have Ice Tornado, suddenly those Ice Tornadoes are doing 60 damage per hit. Oftentimes you're then able to kill frontline units, not just backline units with it, and that's pretty strong. Then you have the Forgotten Name. So Forgotten Name, if you're incanting a lot and you have things like Titan's Tooth or Ice Storm, Ice Tornado, even like Helical Crystallis, any of these ones that have multiple ticks are going to get a lot of benefit out of a Forgotten Name. And then last is Titan Scale, or Tethys Scale, which is a little bit less consistent than Totem Fragment, but still a way to get spell weakness onto units, hopefully giving you more of a chance to pick them off with spells before they reach your pyre, or to reach the floor where you want to sustain with Solgard. In terms of utility, Light's Gift, again, Daze, very easy way to keep your units alive. So making sure that every unit's going to get dazed when they come to the top floor is going to be very good. Cuddlebeard, if you end up pivoting into Cold Channel, or if you have any, Frostbite at all, Titan Sentry, Cold Cilia, Titan's Tooth, any of that kind of stuff is going to all benefit from the extra Frostbite as well as the Frostbite not decaying. And then Sigiled Seaweed is also very, very good. Most runs will have something that is worth silencing, but especially against Patient, it's like, again, 50% chance, and 50% chance means that it never happens. But if it does happen, it's like an auto win against Seraph the Patient. So if you can't get it to work, it's very, very, very strong. And even outside of that, it's very good for like garbage units, or for any other buff-based or not buff based, but trigger based units that might show up throughout the run. Gameplay tips. So yeah, the idea about the build is that it's very flexible. You can go rank 2, and then you can decide. So am I going to go all the way to rank 3? Do I have a way to consistently get my 15 spells off? Do I have already backline access? And then from that, make a judgment call. If, for example, you need to be able to do 2 good-sized hits, you can get Dire Channel. So Dire Channel, put it in the back, and then, or maybe in the middle is probably the best. Put it in the middle, and it's like a multi-strike effect. So then all of your incants also give you that second action trigger as well. Or if you're having trouble hitting the back line, then you can just take Cold Channel. You get the huge amount of health from taking Titan Channel. And yes, you're not going to get as many Frostbite triggers, but now your Frostbite triggers are on a much tankier unit than you would normally have. Plus, you still hit. And that's another good point. Like, Cold Channel normally doesn't actually do, outright damage. It does just the Frostbite. But here you can have damage plus Frostbite. Or alternatively, if you can't go all in, you can go to rank 3, get your 15 spells, and then get your big old Solgard who's going to tank for days and hit like a truck. Very important to note is that Solgard will not get any status effects when played. So that's everything. So any buffs, any debuffs, top floor days, none of that affects Solgard, because when it comes out, it's phased. So just keep that in mind. You get something like damage shield on first unit played. You play Solgard, you just lost that artifact effect. It just doesn't get played. So just think around that you make sure you're playing a unit that you actually want before you play your Solgard who doesn't get the benefit. And then foregone powers, just be cautious with them. Often I start getting rid of foregone powers around the midpoint when I have enough spells that I don't need to worry about playing the foregons, because they slow things down. Even if you have a lot of draw, if 1/3 of your spells are getting yeeted because of foregone powers, it can be kind of frustrating. So early, they're pretty good because they're 0 cost, so they're pretty easy to play. But late, you really want to start getting rid of them unless they are, unless you have like a ton of offering units or offering spells that you can trigger. I would preference not keeping them in the deck. Looking at alternate clans, starting with Hellhorned, or secondary clans starting with Hellhorned, I would avoid imps almost entirely, because units in your deck just slow everything down. And the other part of it is that if you're taking Titan Channel, basically you really need it quite early, and you have all these buffs on your imps. Oftentimes Solgard isn't actually out by the time you're drawing your imps, and then you're playing them into a Solgard who doesn't get affected by them because he's phased. So yeah, I would avoid imps at all. If you get imps, I would maybe pivot to a different Solgard build, because you can get really, you can get screwed over pretty good by not being able to draw your spells because your deck is so full of imps. So if you end up with something like Exile Hellhorned, you might want to pivot into something different. Inferno, interestingly, you can Inferno your Solgard floor. So there is a strategy. You could just use Inferno, not play very many other spells. Use Inferno to clear all your floors, and then play Solgard at Solgard comes online during Relentless. It's actually viable. It's kind of hilarious. Give it a try if you can make it work. I would say it's better if you have like a 2-floor setup where you have a floor above Solgard, maybe an incant floor, and then you have your Inferno Solgard floor who does a lot of damage and then just, comes out at the end. What else? Vent. Vent and Hornbreaker, fantastic tools to deal with backliners if you don't get a sweep unit or you don't get like a Titan Sentry. Then yeah, taking Vent. I would prefer Vent over the Hornbreak, but Vent I think tends to be very, very strong. Hornbreak is also okay. You can also use Branding Right and Dark Deal, although it's a little bit awkward. But yeah, they also work as backline killing if they do enough damage. Overstacking and Ascend, yeah, it works fantastic here. you just put a whole bunch of dudes behind your Solgard, you incant like crazy, and profit from it. So yeah, big fan of that. The other nice thing is you can hidden passage your floor, your top floor. The unit won't go anywhere, but just be aware you can still play hidden passage on the floor, and your unit will just stay there, and it does trigger an incant. So yeah, use it as an incant, but also use it to overstack. And overstacking with incant units tends to be very, very strong. They all take benefit from the incants then. Looking at Awoken, enhancements are fantastic, but you don't want to put them on Solgard. The nice thing is that you don't have to have an enemy on the other side to play your enhancements. So if you have a draft unit, and you should have a draft unit, at least one, you play your draft unit, and then you can play all of your buffs onto the draft unit, which then incants Solgard and brings him online. I wouldn't play them on Solgard once he is online, unless you like desperately need something, or maybe you get like a cycle of life or something. But yeah, buffing up that one other draft unit is a really good way to incant very reliably. And then you also don't feel like you're wasting it. That's one of the things, like when you're incanting, you're like tossing foregone powers into the sky. And yeah, it's good because you're incanting, but you're also not doing anything to the enemy. Here, it's a feel good because you're enhancing and also incanting. And Animus of Will is fantastic, especially if you get root seeds. Also, just pray you get root seeds, man. Root seeds is like, makes this build just so much easier. But even without, yeah, Animus of Will tends to be very, very strong. Get 25 health so that she's not going to die. But then, yeah, just stack up all those enhancements and go to town. Husk Hermit Shattered Shell can also be quite good because they can take care of the backline. What I would recommend there is Quick and Multi-Strike. And as I put in the note, just be very cautious with Temperance because sweep units, they both have very low early damage. And it's very easy for them to get sapped into no damage. And then you have no backline clear. So if you have really good enhancements, then you should be just fine. If you're lacking enhancements, you probably don't want to take a sweep unit into a Seraph the Temperate run. But otherwise, these are going to be very good throughout the whole run. And as I said, just fantastic way to clear backliners, which tends to be the problem with Solgard. Preserve Thorns is an auto pick. You just take it. It's exactly what you want. It's front-loaded incant. So yeah, it's in any incant deck, it's good, but especially in Solgard, the Mighty builds where you're relying on Titan Channel, Preserve Thorns is even better because it's front-loading. You get 4 incants for 1 card. And it's a 1/1 cost card. Next up, Umbra. So with Umbra, I really like this kind of 2-floor setup where you have a Gorge floor and an incant floor. Use all of your morsel generators on your incant floor. And what's great, similar to enhancements, is they're not feel bad. You played a spell, you got something out of it, and then you can play your morsel onto your Gorge floor. So it's a really good way to have spells which, again, don't make you feel bad playing them on an empty floor. And I also find just in general, this tends to work really well because there's no conflict here. You don't have to worry about trying to incant multiple floors or even protect multiple floors. You just play morsel stuff and put them with your units up top. Be cautious about taking too many priority units, but if you have like 3 priority units, 2 that are on your Gorge floor and 1 that's paired with Solgard, tends to be really strong. Lifesteal is fantastic, especially on Titan Channel 3. Lifesteal is the best method of healing Solgard because you can stack it and he will heal himself to full, always, because his damage is as high as his health. So one thing of Lifesteal could be up to 249 heal. Obviously, it's not ever going to be that much, but yeah, it's going to be better than almost any other method. And this is the way you get it, is from Umbra. Ember Drain package, also very, very good. The only issue with Ember Drain package is that like you don't really need rage. You have such a high base damage that it's not that great. And as well, like I don't love damage shield so much because you have such a high health total. It'd be much better to just get Lifesteal. Then you absorb all the hits and you heal it back immediately. So Immortal Trade and Furnace Tap are good. Void Binding, Perils of Production, not so good unless you need Perils of Production for enabling your Ember Drain deck. And finally, yeah, also yes, take capacity. It's just good. I mean, there's not every single build wants capacity, but most of them are happy to have capacity. But just a reminder, Space Prism, Crucible Extension, Mind Jacks, don't go overboard, but having a couple Space Prisms, having one Crucible Extension, taking Mind Jacks is just going to make things a lot easier. And last but not least, Melting Remnant. So important note about Reform and Endless is that when you put Endless or Reform onto Solgard, if it's Titan Channel, if it's any of them, they lose all of their shards when they're reformed. So if that's Titan Channel, that means you have to re-enable Solgard a second or third time by playing out a whole bunch of new incants. So just be very cautious. You really don't want to reform Solgard. It tends to not be very good. Reform especially is not good because the burnout doesn't get applied until after you've phased. So then you bring in Solgard dies, you reform it, and then it comes online just to die immediately to burn out. So, yeah. Do it with your other units. Yeah, have a reform floor, have a harvest floor separate from your Solgard floor. Fantastic. Reform to your heart's content. It's also a pretty good feel-good incant because you get something, you didn't waste a spell on the floor. But just don't do it with Solgard. Crushing Demise. Crushing Demise will not hit Solgard while Solgard is phased. So similar to Inferno, you can do like a Crushing Demise style build where you have Solgard as a solo floor. You just pop units with Crushing Demises, and that enables Solgard to come online just in time for Relentless when then Solgard kills the boss. So it's also a very good strategy. Just be aware of that. And then for backline, there's not a lot. There's not a lot of backline coming out of Melting Remnant. So get Exploding Candle. That's one of the Bane ones. Or just pivot into Cold Channel. Otherwise, you're going to have to rely on units to do your backline, which is fine. I mean, Solgard does a lot of damage. Titan Channel 3 Solgard does 250 base damage. So you can kill that frontliner and then hopefully get to the backliners through other methods. But just be aware, there's not a lot of backline access in terms of drafts coming out of Melting Remnant. All right, next champion. Next champion is Primordium, and this is the Country Kitchen build. So Primordium's a little bit of a weird one to describe because all three upgrade paths play out very similar. And so I'm just going to describe my favorite way to play Primordium, but just know like to say there's a Primordium build is a little bit weird because again, you're playing Primordium basically the same in most of the builds that you have it. But anyway, we'll jump into it anyway. So I prefer to do Superfood plus Stalwart Snack. My preference is Superfood 1 with Stalwart Snack 2. Unless you get an early Retch, then you can reverse. I would almost always take at least one Stalwart Snack if it's available. Mainly because one of the problems with Superfood is the buffs don't last even if you Retch back Primordium. So to get the most value out of those buffs, you want the most buff face stacks as possible. That's why, again, my preference is Superfood 1 with Stalwart Snack 2. I think there are other ways to get sustain than the natural sustain coming from Superfood's rank 2, which gives damage shield. But anyway, jumping into the strategy. So core strategy is use status effects. In particular, you try to get the Ember Drain package. But in general, you get insane buffs all onto a single unit. The main strength is that it has the highest damage ceiling in the game. You will not see higher damage numbers than Primordium can provide. If you have things like Furnace Tap and Rage and stat enhancements, you can just like get insane amounts, right? Like it can get really nuts. And as well, you have decent sustain because Superfood comes with 10 health, which means that 10 health is going to get added every single time if you don't get any other buffs in addition. What are the weaknesses? It's entirely draft dependent. So if you don't get buffs, tough. Backline access can also be a big problem. With Superfood, Primordium also isn't as weak in terms of health, but it still can be a problem. Like if you have spikes or sweep, they'll just rip apart Primordium. It can also be a problem. And then if you go against like, yeah, all the different Seraphs. So Sap is going to be brutal. So Seraph Temperance is really, really difficult. In fact, we'll talk about that here. Seraph Temperant, I think going into Seraph the Temperant with Primordium, unless you have like insane buffs, it's a really, really rough time. Apart from that, Chaste is kind of difficult because of the Ember Drain. If you don't have the Ember Drain package already, then it's fine because you're basically already dealing with Ember Drain. But if you don't, if you're doing like spikes or if you're doing Rage through Hellhorn spells, then it can be very problematic because you're going to have all that halved and you're going to get all of the Ember Drain in addition. Diligent, again, it depends on whether you are Ember Drained or not and whether you can generate Ember while you're Ember Drained or not. If you can't, you're just going to get mowed over by blights, and it's going to be a bad time, and you won't be able to play any of your stuff because a lot of it's going to consume. And that's one of the big problems, right? Like a lot of the ways you enable the Ember Drain package is with things like Perils of Production on Holdover, which doesn't really work into Diligent because if that's the first spell you play, it's consumed. So it can get really tricky there. And then with Patient, I find Patient to be very easy with Primordium builds, as long as you have Damage Shield. If you don't have Damage Shield, it's still possible. You just got to be careful. You might have to switch up which floor you play on, so that Primordium doesn't just get one shot right when it comes out on the first turn. Okay, so Umbra unit priorities. For me, I love Shadow Eater here. I think Shadow Eater is a fantastic companion to Primordium for a couple of reasons. This is one of the ways, especially if you get Wretch, you can actually have Primordium during Relentless and get the effect of the Gorge during Relentless, which normally you can't ever do with Shadow Eater. In addition, Shadow Eater just immediately takes care of your backline. You are guaranteed to get 10 backline damage no matter what, whether you're dazed, whether you're sapped, doesn't matter. You will get 10 backline damage every single time. More if you can fit other morsels in there as well. And then finally, it has a really high health total, and that tends to be what you want. Multi-strike and sweep are also very, very good, but high health totals are very, very strong with Shadow Eater. Next, Crucible Warden. So I prefer the Warden in Primordium builds. One, because it synergizes well with Superfood. Superfood's also granting damage shield, so then you're stacking on stacks, which is much better. The other is you often want multi-strike, and Crucible Warden does really well with multi-strike, where Crucible Collector does not do so well with multi-strike because you lose all of your lifesteal stacks. So I prefer the Warden here, but Collector can also work in a pinch. I would not recommend the Robot, just because because of the fuel mechanic and the lack of capacity, it can often be the case that unless you get like double gorges or you have like ways to get morsels on the floor consistently in addition to Primordium, you could be stuck in a position where you just don't have enough fuel to deal with Relentless, even if you have all of the bonus stats. So just be cautious about it, but you can play it, the Alloyed Construct, but I would say it's not my preference. Last one is Overgorger. Overgorger is always good. The one problem with Overgorger is there's no natural sustain like you would get out of Shadow Eater, Crucible Warden, Crucible Collector. And again, backline damage is going to be a problem unless you get multi-strike. But Overgorger is also very good, so it's not bad there. And the nice thing is you get some pretty consistent gorges, albeit you would reduce a little bit if you have enough morsels to fill out the floor. Then Overgorger's like maybe what you would prefer to put morsels instead of Primordium. Okay. Let's jump into spells. So starting with Ember Drain spells, Immortal Trade. Again, we talked about Lifesteal. It's pretty good. It's not as good as Damage Shield, but it's pretty good. Especially if you get Superfood 1 and you have something with a high health total and a high damage and it's not multi-striking, Immortal Trade becomes amazing. And the fact is you just get more out of it. You just get more out of it for less cost. Perils of Production. applying 3 rage and Ember Drain, or yeah, applying 3 rage. It's also not just the rage buff, but it's also the main enabler for Ember Drain decks. You need to get holdover on it, and then you're just profiting from all of the free Ember every turn, and you don't have to worry about Ember Drain. Void Binding is the second best of the Ember Drain package. You get a lot of rage, you get the damage shield. All of that's going to be fantastic under Primordium. Then, of course, the king of all Ember Drain cards is Furnace Tap. And Furnace Tap just puts this build through the roof if you get it. You basically hope for it. Like with every single run with Superfood, you hope you get Furnace Tap. If you don't, it's sad, but it's the one thing that makes Primordium overpowered when you get it, and mediocre if you don't. But that's the way the game works. In terms of utility, Mind Collapse tends to be pretty good as another Ember Drain enabler. As long as you get a +10 and holdover, you're often going to have units you can pick off. It's not guaranteed, but often you will. Prismal Dust, also very good. You get a big bunch of Ember, you dump it onto Primordium, and then all of that damage shield gets applied to your Gorge unit, which is fantastic. Ember Cache, another enabler. It's not a permanent enabler, but it is a temporary enabler. It can become permanent if you get -1 and remove Consume. Then you can keep playing Ember Caches, getting more Excavated Embers, and then you can generate Ember. It's a little bit more speculative than Perils of Production or Mind Collapse, but it can work in a pinch. And Wretch. Wretch is the Wretch is the way that you can do a lot of nasty stuff with Primordium. Just note that Wretch will not bring back buffs, and that's all buff status effects. So you won't get Multi-Strike, you won't get Trample, you won't get Quick, you won't get any of these status effects, including Rage and Armor and all that kind of stuff. So just be cautious about that, but despite that, Wretch is still very, very good with Primordium, because then you're guaranteed more Gorges even going into Relentless. And last but not least, Umberstone, getting Trample. And a lot of these ones that are like this, Trample, Fragile, Quick, they get applied onto Primordium, and then they get applied onto the unit that Gorges, because they are status effects. And you can't obviously stack them, so having more Trample doesn't mean anything. Same with more Quick. But it's a good way to get some really solid clear out of your unit in the front once they've gorged Primordium, sorry. In terms of relics, again, relics that are going to give buffs at the very beginning are very, very good. So Refined Void, giving you Lifesteal, Chain of Gems, giving you Damage Shield, and then, what is it, Armored, what is it called? Armored, Hammered Chest Plates. Hammered Chest Plates, giving you a little bit more health. All of that's going to be good. I mean, Hammered Chest Plates is not amazing, but it does stack with how many buffet stacks you get, which can be really valuable. In terms of Gorge synergy, then you're looking at Fossilized Fangs, which is just always going to be good. It doesn't double the Eat triggers, so that's important to note. It doesn't double Eat triggers. It just doubles the Gorge triggers, I think. Someone maybe can correct me, but does it double Gorge? I think it just doubles Gorge triggers, not Eat triggers. Anyway, regardless, if you get it with any type of Gorge unit, so Shadow Eater or either the Shrouds or the Robot, then suddenly it's a lot easier to scale, and you scale a lot faster. All the rest of the other three are all going to just generate more morsels, which can be really good in addition to your Primordium. Morsel is also going to be, worth adding onto the floor. And then finally for utility, Hell's Banners for Ember. Again, another Ember Drain enabler. As long as you have morsels, the morsels are free, and you can play them out and generate Ember to deal with your Ember Drain. Mind Jacks. Mind Jacks is also just fantastic. It's a guaranteed way to get extra capacity, and then you can fit more morsels on the same floor. I mean, nothing more really to say about it. It's one of my favorite relics in addition. I think it's just one of the most consistent ones, because you just always want capacity. Having more units is just always better. And then finally, I actually really like the Advanced Prototype. Gosh, naming things is hard. Advanced prototype. Train stewards are actually really good. If you can get advanced prototype, train stewards can be your gorge unit. You get the damage shield, you get the multi-strike, which is two things that are fantastic to have on the unit. And then, even the damage goes up. So it's not bad. If you get the a train steward, then you've buffed up. Maybe you put even like an extra multi-strike or quick or something like that on it. Then it can get really, really out of hand combined with Primordium. Okay. Next up is general gameplay tips. So first thing is just like there's always this struggle between who do you buff in emergencies, and my rule of thumb is like unless you're going to unless you know you're going to die, buff Primordium, because in the long run it's almost always better. The exception is like the very last turn of buffet. Obviously you don't care because it's the same amount regardless. But if it's like early on, I would lean on the edge of like still keep buffing Primordium unless you are like pretty certain it's going to lead to death if you don't. Because you just get more value out of it in the long term. I would not go superfood if you're going against Seraph the Temperate. It's not like a hard and fast, like you can't do it, but you really have to have an amazingly solid build that has way more rage or way more stat buffs than you have sap. And that is such a tall order because you are essentially getting double, sometimes triple sap onto your front unit because of how Penumbra works. So just be very cautious. You need a lot of buffs to overcome sap in that case. As I mentioned, Alloyed Construct is very risky due to the fuel mechanic. But if you have spare capacity and can fit a lot of other morsels, then do it. Or if you get Fossilized Fangs, it's maybe a little bit better. But just be careful. Be careful. And I make the mistake, and you've seen in runs. If you've watched my videos, you've seen I do runs where I take Alloyed Construct thinking it's going to be good, and it just ends up, falling flat a little bit. So just be cautious about it. It's not a don't ever take, but it's a tough one to make work. And then I mentioned this before, but getting Stalwart Snack is almost always better than the damage shield. It's not always the case, but in most cases, I think getting Stalwart Snack is better because then the buffs last longer. Or let me say it again, you can stack longer. The buff lasts, if you put some stat enhancements or if you get rage or if you get damage shield, you're going to get it for much longer and get it much higher. Multi-strike especially, like that's when Stalwart Snack, you're really happy you have it. Okay, let's jump into secondary clans, starting with Hellhorn. So demons. I would say if you're going to do demons, the two best demons, in my opinion, are Branded Warrior and Deranged Brute. Deranged Brute because he's making the rage that much better for both Primordium and himself, and Branded Warrior because he will generate rage on himself and onto Primordium, which then fuels this feedback loop, where if Branded Warrior has multi-strike and is killing like one or two things per turn, that all gets added on to Primordium, who gives it back to the Branded Warrior. So you end up just getting this really sick feedback loop. And then, Deranged Brute just for the extra rage damage. Armor, very good as well. Armor is very good because you can stack it really high. You continue to stack it over and over again. And because Primordium isn't getting hit typically, you're going to keep stacking that extra armor on top of what the front unit already has. So it's a really good way to get I've seen where you can get 600-700 armor without even having to double armor because you get so much onto Primordium. One Horn's Tome, just be very careful. If you have consistent damage shield and consistent armor, do it. But just be very, very careful because you are guaranteed to put Fragile on your front unit and onto Primordium. And if they don't have any way of dealing with spikes or sweep or just even not getting enough damage shield armor to make it work, you're just going to die. So just be very careful. It's very good, similar to Furnace Tap. Multi-strike onto Primordium is very good, but the Fragile is rough. You just got to be prepared for it. And Imps. Imps can also work. So as long as you have capacity, the nice thing is that a lot of the Imps affect the whole floor. Well, specifically Fledgling Imp affects the whole floor, which is quite good. If you have a Welder Helper, you can frontline with Primordium, stack armor, which then goes onto your other unit. Just make sure that you're always gorging with the gorge unit you want and not with a random imp instead. So that's one of the important things. I mean, that's true of all imp builds in any way, is to make sure you know how to get rid of your imps. But especially with this type of build, there's a danger that you accidentally start getting buffet stacks onto, or getting gorge onto your imp, and then you feel bad. So just be cautious, but it can work really well if you have the capacity. Looking at Awoken, enhancements are fantastic. I mean, enhancements are the lifeblood of Primordium, especially if you get a lot of Stalwart Snack upgrade paths, or if you get at least 2 Stalwart Snack. Yeah, the best ones, in my opinion, are Sharpen and Cycle of Life, because not only do you get the stat, but then you also get the buff. And spikes can be very, very good when they're stacking up to somewhere around 20 to 40, depending on how many spikes and how many buffet stacks you have. You can get a lot of value out of the spikes in addition. So yeah, enhancements are always going to be good. The only one you have to be a little bit concerned about is sometimes Razor Sharp Edge, you get too low and you don't have enough health. But if you have a unit that already has a lot of health, then Razor Sharp Edge becomes really good because you get more value than you would out of all the other enhancements. So anyway, summary is all enhancements are good. Just be cautious with Razor Sharp Edge that you don't accidentally, lower Primordium's health that you're not able to sustain. Awoken Hollow is hilarious. If you have rejuvenation triggers and Awoken Hollow, similar to like Branded Warrior, you get this feedback loop where Awoken Hollow rejuvenates, making the Primordium a lot thicker, which then goes right back onto Awoken Hollow, and you can get this massive feedback loop. And if you get something like a couple multi-strike, then that Awoken Hollow is going to get just out of control. So one of my favorite combos. It's a really hilarious combo. If you can get it, just be happy. If you get Root Seeds, it's a little bit less good, but then you just look for Awake or any other regen, then you're just fine. Or even just some of the direct healing spells, and you're going to be just fine. Other thing with Awoken is Sweep. Sweep is also very, very good because you get those stats and then it affects the whole floor. Quick, Sweep, Quick as well. Both of them are fantastic to put onto, or the Sweep units are good to put with Primordium, and then Quick is good to put onto both. If you get a Quick Sweep, then you're in business for most of the run, as long as you can get your damage scaling high enough on Primordium or get enough multi-strike or something like that. Okay, Stygian Guard. So Stygian Guard is a little bit tough because there's not really a lot of ways to buff Primordium. The main way is with Guardian Stone. So having Guardian Stone plus Primordium plus another unit, so let's say you get like a Titan Sentry or another one of the Sirens, and then you have a Guardian Stone. Guardian Stone will stack up armor onto Primordium every time you incant, and then all of that gets added onto the front unit. So it's a really good way to like pump out so much armor that none of the enemies can get through your frontliner. And again, Sweep, right? So Sweep is really good because you take all those stats and you apply them to the whole floor. Melting Remnant, Burnout and Endless. So both are considered status effects. They both carry over, which for better or worse. Endless is usually pretty good to carry over because it means that your Gorge unit does have Endless. And if that's the case, you may even want to consider playing on the second floor so that after your unit dies, you can immediately bring them back onto the third floor. With Burnout, it's a double-edged sword, right? So yes, Burnout's going to carry over, but if you don't want Burnout on your unit, then all of a sudden it becomes a problem. But there's some like really good combos there. Like if you get like for example, a Paraffin Enforcer as your unit, you put Burnout onto your Primordium, and now you get all the extra rage, and you get that feedback loop again, where your unit is generating status effects onto your Primordium, which then gets put back onto the unit again and double scales. So it could be really good, but just be aware of that. Also, what's cool with Endless is that no matter how Primordium dies, whether it's from getting buffet stacks eaten all or from dying, will still come back, and it will come back without having any burnout or anything else. The other method is that you can do reform, and I actually like it. What I would say I don't normally do it with superfood because of the whole burnout thing, but like you can still do it. But the idea is that you have Primordium die, usually by having Primordium frontline, and then when Primordium dies and you reform, you get all those bonus stats, and you can start stacking that up really, really high, and that can work really well. It's another way to do it. And if you're okay getting burnout under your unit, all the better. You're going to get all the extra burnout. And again, you get the amount, right? So it's not just that you get one burnout. If Primordium has 2 or 3 burnout, you're going to get that 2 or 3 burnout onto the unit every turn, which means oftentimes you don't have to worry so much about it. Okay, last but not least, we have our final build, which is the Big Icarus build with Little Fade. No, we're not doing Firelight. I think Firelight is a little bit too straightforward to pilot. I wanted to talk about how to make Little Icarus work. I mean, if you've been watching my streams recently, you know we had some pretty big Icarus builds recently. So let's talk about how you make that work. What's my recommended strategy, and just in general, what are some good synergies to help these builds be more successful? First is you take Little Icarus all the way to 3. I think you need it. Certainly you can scale pretty high, but then neither of the pivots are very good. So you don't want Firelight rank 1. You're not really trying to like improve your units. It's really about just getting as much stats onto Little Fade as possible. And similar, Endless doesn't really work that great. Yes, you would not have to worry about having to reform, but actually the reform is part of what makes the build work pretty well, is that you get the stat buffs. So my recommendation, stick with just all 3 into Little Icarus. Core strategy, kill everything possible with Little Fade and scale using the damage and the permanent damage and spikes that you get from your slay triggers. And it really is like, it's all about how do you target enemies, or how do you set up enemies in a particular way to make sure you're always killing them with Little Fade as much as possible. That's what's going to win the strategy. The strength is that it has consistent backlines. You have spikes from the very beginning. So as long as you keep playing Little Fade, you're guaranteed to be able to kill the backline. And then as well, by the end, you're also bursting frontliners pretty consistently. You get both the spikes, and then if Little Fade survives, you also then get the damage. So you're basically hitting twice. It's like a multi-strike effect on the frontliners, and then an instant kill on the backliners. Main weaknesses. Early trials can be brutal, especially armor trials. The one trial it's actually very good to get is enemy start on every floor. You just auto pick that because it's a way to get scaling. Yeah, you'll take some pyre health in damage, but then you'll be able to scale a little bit faster. And then high health frontliners. If you get, in particular, the damage shield ring 1, I'm sorry. Nothing more to say. I'm sorry. It's very unfortunate, but it does happen. Sometimes you get the damage shield ring 1, and it's a rough time. Later, hopefully, you can make up for it. But yeah, any armor trials at all, you just skip them. The only exception would be ring 7 armor trials, because usually by then you have enough damage. But yeah, early armor trials, just don't mess. You'll never get a unit, or you'll never get money worth the lack of kills you're going to get onto Little Fade. In terms of difficulty, Chaste is not so difficult, actually. You would think with spikes that Chaste would have you'd have a problem against Chaste, but in reality, it tends to be pretty average because you let her die, and every time she's played, she gets the full value of her spikes. So even though Little Fade, will get cleansed a couple of times, once she dies, then it comes all right back. One thing to note is you just want to make sure she's not living too long. The longer that she lives, the more likely you are to have units that aren't going to get killed by her spikes. So you try to keep her alive maximum 2 rounds. So let her get, she can get cleansed once, and then, let her die. The way you can work around that as well is you can play 2 floors and make sure you're playing her on the floor with Seraph. That's another way to get around it, because it's very unlikely that Seraph will cleanse and then move. It's more likely he'll move and then cleanse. It's not always the case, but you're often going to see that he'll move and then cleanse the other floor, and you could then extend for an extra turn. Diligent, it really depends on how many reforms you have and how reliant you are on like natural reform. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. If you run out of reforms and Little Fade's dead, you're in trouble. Or if you only have like one reform by the end because so many have been consumed, then it can be problematic. So it's, do you have enough spells to make sure you can constantly reform? And if you do, then it's quite easy, easier even than Chaste. If you don't, then it can be quite difficult. Temperate, I think, is the most consistent way to win because the big damage dealers are the backliners, and you're going to kill them fairly easily. The frontliners will die. Hopefully you have enough to kill the frontliner on your first turn. And then after that, once you get over like 16 to 21 health, you'll kill 2 units per floor. And that's enough to take care of most of the units. By the end, once you are stacked up to like, I don't know, 30 plus health, then you're killing even 3 or 4 units at a time. So by the end, it gets quite easy. And you don't care about the sap because she dies and then just comes right back, and she has such a high damage anyway, it's not too concerning. Patient can be difficult because of the rally triggers that make Relentless a little bit difficult. And the other part that I actually didn't mention this here, the other part that makes Patient difficult is that Patient doesn't multi-strike. So you get less value out of your spikes than you would against any of the other 3 who are multi-striking. So I would maybe even bump up Patient to a 4 just because you don't get the multi-strike. But I would say none of them are particularly difficult. As long as you're watching with rally triggers, as long as you have enough reform, as long as you're able to scale up enough to kill most of the backliners, you're going to be fine with any one of the Seraphs. Unit priorities. I really like Big Sludge in the build. What I typically do is you try not to get actually kills with Big Sludge. You try to have Big Sludge there to kind of stack up, and then you can put Little Fade behind. So I prioritize health. I don't get multi-strike. I just give Big Sludge a lot of health. And then, Big Sludge can kind of do a little bit of damage to the frontliners, hopefully not killing them. And then Little Fade's able to pick up the rest of the kills. So I quite like that. I think it's pretty good. That or the Harvest Baron, very similar. Stack health, don't stack damage, don't get multi-strike, don't get quick, just stack health. And then it's a way during Relentless to have something that's pretty tanky and especially can grow with damage up until you go into Relentless combat. Lady of the Reformed is also quite good. Again, stack health. And then the idea is after you've died a few times and you're getting ready for Relentless, then you can play Little Fade behind the Lady of the Reformed, and Little Fade will get all of the burnout extension from the Revenge trigger and be able to stick around a little bit longer. Although, I mean, oftentimes it's not the burnout that's the problem, it's that you have not that much health and then she dies there. But still quite good. You just want to tank in front so that you can get more effects or you can get more value out of the damage that Little Fade's going to stack. And Legion of Wax. Legion of Wax is just a very, very solid tank. And because of the 4 capacity, normally you would try to avoid it. But here it's totally fine. Again, with Legion of Wax, it's all about the health. So you just stack health. You don't worry about damage. You're trying to get all your damage with Little Fade. That's the goal. In terms of spells, it's all about the reform. So Molded, Wicked Blaze. In a pinch, you can do Sacred Wicks, but to be honest, I don't particularly like it with this build. But in general, targeted molding is very good because then you can guarantee that you're always going to get back Little Fade and not a Train Steward or whatever else you might end up having by a mistake. And then the other part is just getting the burnout spells. I really like Wickless Recruitment. It's a fantastic way to jump into Relentless and not have to worry about Little Fade dying from burnout. So you play Little Fade behind your tank, you play Wickless Recruitment, and then you don't have to worry about it. So I'd get Permafrost on it and then just hold it until Relentless combat. Hallow Drippings, very similar. 5 burnout is almost like removing burnout because it's very unlikely that Little Fade's going to survive those 5 extra hits. But yeah, so you just put Permafrost on it and then you wait, play it at the end to keep Little Fade alive longer during Relentless combat. Purifying Cleanse, also very similar. Wicklash, very similar. You normally don't want to heal Little Fade. You want her to die and reform so that you can get enough stats So I wouldn't necessarily play them before Relentless. These are really cards that on every case I would put Permafrost just to get a little bit more value out of the Relentless combat. Because you really want her to scale with the Reform health. That's the biggest part, is the extra health. So you get more spikes damage, you can take more, you live a little bit longer. In terms of relics, Fade's First Blade's pretty good. It's only really good for Relentless, but there you can sometimes get enough damage to maybe get some kills you wouldn't normally be able to get. Then the Hammer Chestplates, again, extra health tends to be really good with Little Fade. If you get Hammer Chestplates early, that can mean you can start off right from the very beginning getting like 2 or 3 kills in the first term played, which normally you're not able to do with Little Fade. So that can be quite good. That's basically it for buffs. Looking at Death's Energy, the relic is called... Let me jump into the logbook again. I know what it does. I just don't always remember the names of all of them. It is called Memorial Fund. So Memorial Fund is a good way to also take advantage of the fact that Little Fade's going to die so much. You get coins every time she dies, which can help you with your spell upgrades, your unit upgrades, or getting relics. Extinguish Trigger, if you have another unit on the same floor, then you're going to be able to stack armor onto that unit every time Little Fade dies, which tends to be very valuable. And then Resin Block, good just as a way to scale up even harder. I wouldn't say it's gonna wreck their world, but it can be very beneficial as you're preparing for Relentless combat to get that kill on the boss, which is sometimes a thing. Like, you've seen me play. Sometimes you have something as simple as like Paraffin Enforcer who randomly gets the kill at the end. So getting more and more damage onto Little Fade will help to make sure she actually gets the kill on the boss rather than somebody else. For utility, Combustible Wax tends to be really good because then you don't have to worry so much about burnout. Little Fade should be dying to damage anyway. She doesn't have that much health, so she'll die naturally to enemy units, and then you don't ever have to worry about her dying from burnout when you play this. If you have this plus one other burnout applicator, she'll survive, or she'll die to getting hit before she'll die to burnout. Flicker's Liquor, you're going to play her a lot, making a lot of spells very free. Can be very useful. And then Hell's Banners for the same reason. You play her, maybe you're playing another unit as well. Then you can generate some Ember. So gameplay tips. Again, the entire focus of the build is get as many kills onto Little Fade as possible. Here are my soft targets that I use. If you've seen me play before, I mention this a lot. I've updated them slightly after looking at some of my recent runs and also looking at health on units. So my recommendation is you try to get at least 20 kills by the time you finish Ring 3. So that would be 40 spikes, 40 damage, because you get 2 per at rank 1. Then you need an additional 30 kills from Ring 4 to Ring 6. At least 30. That will put you up to close to 130. So 30 at that point is an extra 90, putting you at around 120. So probably more like 53 to 55 is what you need so that you can get 130 damage. The 130 damage is going to be extremely important for Ring 7, which tends to be the hardest one to get final kills on. And there, in that Ring 7, you need to be killing probably 12 to 15 units. And that can be quite tough, but killing another 12 units there adds an extra 48 damage and spikes, which is then enabling you to solo frontliners in your first play. And that's the goal. The goal is build everything up so that you can guarantee solo the frontliner. Now, with some Seraphs, you don't have to worry about that quite as much. For example, Seraph, the Patient, is only a 5 health unit. Seraph, the Chaste, it's only a 120 health unit, I think, 110, 120. But against the other two, you're going to have much higher health units. So just make it easy. Try to get to 180, and that's your goal. And that means having to play specifically to get as many kills as possible with Little Fade, setting things up, manipulating floors, using whatever tools you have to try to guarantee kills on her. As I mentioned, avoid trials ring 1 and armor trials ring 1 and 2. They will basically throw your whole run, so just don't tempt fate. Don't take them. It will never be worth it. It's never worth that risk. And again, try to position to get kills. Take a draft unit that can tank rather than something that's going to steal kills. Okay, I think that's good enough for general gameplay tips. Let's jump into some secondary clan options. So with Hellhorn, armor is a fantastic way to prep, and it avoids the need to scale with reform. So if you can get like early armor imps or any early armor at all, I would say after like ring 2 or 3, then you can rely on the armor stacking rather than having to rely on reform over and over again. And that eliminates completely the issues with burnout, and it allows you to get health or effective health much higher than you would ever get with reform. With reform, you're thinking like, let's say she's dying every turn, anywhere from like 25 to 40 health. With armor, you can easily surpass that with just like a few armor spells. So yeah, armor is fantastic, and especially later on in the runs will help you to get very, very consistent kills without having to have her die over and over, which can be really beneficial. With demons, I would take a cheap tanky demon like Steelworker or Railbeater, something that can tank at the end for Relentless and not really, yeah, you're not going to worry about either of them killing your frontliners. So, and then Martyr Shields. Martyr Shields certainly defensively can be used, but I would also say it's very good offensively. If you are going to die to your first hit, then you can Martyr Shields a backliner to the front, make sure the backliner is going to die, and then you can replay Little Fate on a higher floor to kill the frontliner. Okay, next up is Awoken. With Awoken, Adaptive Mutation is insane. So just base, taking one Adaptive Mutation means that all of your damage becomes health, and if you have high enough spikes, you're going to kill everything with spikes anyway, and not ever have to worry about burning out or anything like that. Like if you're hitting those numbers like I mentioned, where you're having like 40 spikes and so on, it's very easy to just get insane amounts of health very, very quickly. And if you happen to get super lucky, hit the jackpot, and get both Adaptive Mutation and Gnarled Root, you actually get this kind of scaling, because Gnarled Root will add your spikes damage to your regular damage. Then you do the swap and you maintain the Gnarled Root's damage, and it's like you get double the effect. And every time you play it, your spikes damage gets added, starting from, first gets added to your health, then it gets added to your damage, then it gets added to your health, and it gets added to your damage. So every single time, you're adding your full value of your spikes to your stats, which can get out of hand very, very quickly. Apart from Adaptive Mutation, anything that you don't want to play spells that grant spikes, but anything that will enhance spikes is going to be really strong. So Gnarled Root we already talked about. The Crucible will also work. And then finally the Channeler, the Shard Channeler. All of those are going to be really, really, really strong as a way to scale the value of your spikes, whether that's because spikes do more damage or because you get the damage from your spikes, with Gnarled Root specifically. And then last, I would say Awoken Hollow is your best bet. I don't love Thorn Hollow because Thorn Hollow kill steals pretty consistently. Either one of the Animus will do the same. They're going to steal kills, and same with the sweeps. So I recommend get Awoken Hollow. You can also get the what is it called? The other Hollow unit. Let me just double check the name. Wilting Sapwood. Oh, and I totally missed. You could also get the Vine Mother is also fantastic. So I would say Vine Mother, Awoken Hollow are the best. Everything else is going to steal kills from you. All right, enough with Awoken. Let's go into Stygian Guard. With Stygian Guard, honestly, I would maybe consider not taking Little Fade or Little Icarus, because there's only one synergy. The single synergy is Guardian Stone. So Guardian Stone allows you to scale up your Little Fade's armor so that she can survive, but that's like the one major synergy. Everything else is going to be about using spell damage to hopefully hit the front unit enough to get the kill. And I think it's really tough. You're almost always going to be better off going with something else. So just my recommendation, I would probably just skip out on the build if you go with Stygian Guard, because there's just really no synergies there. Next is Umbra. With Umbra, damage shield is very similar to armor. It's not quite as good because armor can stack, and you can get, like, for example, 25 armor is typically gonna block more hits. Not always, but typically gonna block more hits than like 2 damage shield. So then stacking a lot of damage shield, especially against Seraph, it's gonna go away very quickly. But still, it's quite good. If you have enough damage shield to support, then it can be good as a way to sustain and avoid having to keep reforming Little Fate over and over again. Shrouds are very good tanks. We just saw, for those that are watching, the guide didn't see, but you'll see it if you look at some of the builds that we ended up doing for the demonstration. But anyway, either Crucible Ward and Crucible Collector are going to be fantastic tanks because they can get all those buff stacks. They're typically going to be unharmed because most things should be dying to Little Fade. And then you stack up all the buffs, and then you put Little Fade in the back, and they are very good at protecting her while she does all the damage to the boss. Okay, so with that, those are my 5 builds to make Seraph soil his armor. Links in the descriptions for all of the example builds. These were the example builds that were successful. I have removed all of the example builds that were not successful unless you watched it live on stream. Hope this is helpful for you. I hope it's as helpful as people have been saying the original guide is. The exiles are a little bit different. I feel like they have a little bit more straightforward play than some of the original champions. But still, I think that these builds are quite fun. Certainly one of the more enjoyable ways that I like to play. And if you like the video and want to see more of this kind of content, would love to see you support the channel. You can support via Patreon. You can support on Twitch through subscribing, and then just support by liking and subscribing on YouTube. We just hit 500 subscribers on YouTube. Again, thank you so much for your support so far. Hope to continue to grow the channel. Hope that with the DLC coming out in, at least from now, just over a month, that there's a lot more traction in Monster Train, a lot more interest. I certainly think the game is worth it. I hope that more people get interested in it. And I hope for those of you that are playing it, that this could help you consistently start winning at Covenant 25. Thanks for watching.